Let's talk about what you do in your first speech. This is going to be first speech strategies. First speech strategies, this outline right here. Got it? What should you do in your first speech? This is applicable to any kind of debate. So not just public forum, not just Lincoln Douglas, not just policy debate, but any kind of debate that we have. What should you be doing in your very first speech? The first thing you want to do is tell a story. When you're in a debate round, you are standing up trying to convince an audience, whether that be one judge, whether that be an opponent in a classroom, whether that be a teacher, whether that be a large group of people, no matter what kind of debate it is, you're trying to convince people that your position is accurate. People are much more willing to believe something if they can identify with it. And so this is all about telling a story. You want to tell a story that is going to engage your audience. Engage your audience. Find a story that your audience is going to believe. Make it something that they care about. Maybe it's hundreds of children every year die in car accidents. And I have a plan to reduce the number of children who die in car accidents. Well, the vast majority of us were children. In fact, all of us were children. And we're all probably pretty happy that we're still around. And so increasing the likelihood that if we were children in a car, we wouldn't die is something that would interest us. So we've engaged our audience. Second, we want to highlight the problem. Highlight the problem. What is the problem? So is it that children are dying in car accidents? Is it that millions of children go to bed without food in their stomachs every night? What's this problem that we in the audience should care about? And why should we care about it? Why do I care about what's going on in your life? Well, because we have similar needs. We both need to eat. And so the fact that hundreds of children go to bed hungry each night in the United States or in my city or in my county or town or in my neighborhood or in my school, hundreds of people going hungry every night suddenly matters because it's going to highlight the problem. It shows how big of a problem it is, but it also makes it relevant to me. So you've engaged your audience to say it's a big enough problem that you should listen to me. It's something that's relevant to you and highlights what is the problem. And thirdly, you're going to frame the debate. Frame the debate. How should we as the audience be thinking about this? When you start telling me that kids are starving every day, my whole frame of reference is going to be on hunger, is going to be on the need for food. When we frame the debate in that way, your first speech that tells a story is going to frame the debate in such a way that as an audience member, I'm much more prone to want to vote with you or to want to put myself in a position where your solution is going to be the answer to my question. Once we've told our story, we need to think about who is doing the talking. The person doing the talking in the first speech is the first speaker. Whether you're in Lincoln Douglas debate and you're by yourself, whether you're in public forum, parliamentary debate, policy debate, or other teams types of debate where it's one speaker on a team, or whether you are one person out of a large group of people who agree with a particular position and you're the first person who gets to rise up to speak. Maybe you're in a Model United Nations competition and you're the first one rising on a resolution. In any of these situations, you need to be the one talking. Whoever is the one talking, it needs to be in that speaker's voice. Write the case in that speaker's voice. In that speaker's voice. Who is speaking? The first speaker. She sounds like this. This case should be written to sound like her. Make the case fit the presenter. Fit the presenter. But there's some debate about this. How should the cases be structured, especially when you're in a team setting? So you have two individuals. You have your big, burly guy and your littler guy as partners in a debate round. And the littler guy is giving the first speech. Some people would say, well, you need to figure out a case that both of them can advocate well. And that's true. But the first speech needs to sound like it comes from whoever is giving that speech. I don't want to hear a really strong-looking guy stand up and tell me about something that's just scary to all high school kids. Because I'm just not going to believe that a 6'6", 250-pound guy is scared of something in the same way that I'm going to believe somebody else is afraid of it. That doesn't mean it's not true, but it's just the optics on it are hard. So make the case fit the presenter. This is also true in certain cases where we're talking about a specific gender. If a specific gender is harmed in the current system and somebody of the opposite gender is the one advocating, it can be difficult. And that may not be the kind of case that fits that presenter. In the vast majority of debate situations, there are lots of options about angles to take on the specific arguments you're making. And so this might mean that you don't take the most obvious angle because you as the presenter don't seem comfortable talking about a particular topic. So make sure the cases fit the presenter. So it comes out in your voice, but it also fits you and your personality. Finally, the content, the tone, the density, it all is going to have to reflect the speaker. All going to reflect the speaker. So if you have a younger debater getting up using very high level vocabulary, that debater had better be using high level vocabulary in future speeches. The last thing you need is a very high level vocabulary or very in-depth analysis in the very first speech by a debater, and then in later speeches they don't follow it up in the same setting. Then it's very obvious to anyone listening that this speaker didn't write this speech. This speaker is just reading someone else's speech. And you're just not anywhere near as credible if everyone just thinks you are reading someone else's speech instead of making your own arguments, making your own speech. So think about who's talking. The speaker, whoever is talking, is the one who ought to be the one whose voice it appears to be coming out of that very first speech. Lots of debaters like to use unique structures. And in policy debate, people like to use a lot of structures that aren't what we would typically expect. But it's important to keep in mind that when we're going to use a unique structure, the judge is expecting the basic structure. Judges expect basic structure. The judge is not going to think, oh, I'm expecting that they're going to come up with 3 or 4 different unique structures in this debate round. So that means in policy, you're going to have a plan meets needs case. In Lincoln Douglas, it's going to be value, criterion, and 3 contentions that support the value and criterion. And in public forum, it's going to be 3 contentions that support the resolution independently, any of which will stand on their own. That's what the judge is expecting when they walk into the room. It's important to remember that Q points typically result in losses. Cute points end in losses. If you're just trying to be cute, so you're trying to make this really cute point that you think the judges will find entertaining, it's probably not going to help you win the debate. And maybe it's okay to use those kinds of arguments, but don't think that those are the arguments that are going to win you the debate round. And they're going to often end in losses because they're going to confuse the judge. They're not going to be the sorts of arguments that other people have been making, so the judge not expecting those arguments. These are things we call squirrel cases, maybe. These are the types of arguments that judges have never heard of, and often they're going to vote against just because they don't fully understand them. And we don't have enough time in a debate round to fully explain things. If you're going to use a unique structure, you need to ask yourself, what are the 3 reasons to use this special structure? You should have at least 3 reasons. So maybe it's in a policy debate, I'm going to use a structure other than plan meets needs. Maybe it's comparative advantage, because I think the status quo is doing a good job. I honestly think that there's a plan out there to help the status quo improve, but it doesn't really solve any problem. And I think that an improvement in the system could provide big enough benefits that I will still be able to tell a compelling story. 3 reasons like that. If you can't come up with 3 good reasons to argue in favor of a different structure than what the judges are expecting, this basic structure, then just go back to the basic structure. The judges are going to feel more comfortable, your opponent's going to feel more comfortable with it, and at the end of the day, that's going to give you a much more full debate round. Finally, remember that clarity trumps cuteness. Clarity trumps cuteness. Clarity is more important than cuteness. No matter what kind of argument you're making, it needs to be clear. We've talked about this many times before, but it's vital when we're talking about case structures. It's more important that your judge and audience fully understand what you're talking about. So if you're saying, here's the problem, here's the causes, here's my solution, a typical persuasive speech format, if that's what you're going to do, don't try to throw some cute little twist in there at the end that say, here's the solutions. Or maybe these solutions would work too. Well, pick one and stick with it. So clarity over cuteness every single time. So now that we've talked about who's talking, we've talked about the importance of telling a story, and we've talked about how unique structures play a role in the very first speech, let's think about some strategy. What should you be thinking about with your partner or by yourself when you're preparing this very first speech in a debate round? What are the strategic considerations you should be making? How do you win the debate round from the very first speech? Think of it kind of in the volleyball setting of bump, set, and spike. So when we bump the ball, passing it to your teammate, you want to point out interesting but non-debatable things. So helping your audience understand the background, understand the history, understand the context. Why are we having this debate? Why is it important to understand that this many children don't have physical activity in their typical day? Why does this matter? Tell me these sorts of things. Why is Russia a danger to the United States, or why do we consider Russia a danger to the United States? These are the sorts of considerations you should be thinking about. But these are just basic things. You're just passing them off. Odds are that bump's going to be totally ignored. People need to have those context clues in the back of their head, but that's not going to matter in the actual disposition of the debate round. Then you want to set. What else should you be talking about? So you've laid out a very basic foundation for your audience. Now you need to set. You need to set up your opponent to make bad arguments and set up yourself to make strong ones. So you want your opponent to make bad arguments and yourself to make good arguments. How do you do this? You want to bring out things that you know your opponent wants to talk about, but put them in certain context and put them in a certain way that when your judge or your audience hears them, they're going to be sympathetic to your position. If they become sympathetic to your position and then your opponent begins to argue them in a different way, the odds are your opponent is not going to make as strong of an argument. Your opponent may jump on that argument, but start looking bad to your audience. In the same way, there's certain arguments that you might really want to help your team highlight throughout the round. And these are the arguments that you want to set yourself up to look good. So if you know that there are 5 really important researchers who all agree, the top researchers in the field, who all agree that your proposal or your philosophy is the way that this analysis should be done, then you want to bring up the credibility of authors from the very beginning and talk about how important it is to have the experts agree. And if the experts agree on something, that's the direction we should be going. Well, what's that going to do? It's going to set you up to look good because your opponent is not going to have those most eminent people in the field. Instead, your opponent is going to have people who are lower down, lower ranked in the field who don't agree with you. But you're going to always be able to point to those people who do agree with you, who are at the top of the field. And finally, you should spike. So you've bumped the ball, you've talked about the basic issues, you've set yourself up for good arguments and your opponent up to make arguments that aren't his or her strong arguments. And finally, you want to spike. You want to reject the strong arguments that your opponent has by talking about those things before they have a chance to bring them up. So a spike simply means I'm going to say, I know my opponent will be saying that 5 children every year die of starvation, but if we allow genetically modified foods, those 5 children not only will survive much longer in their lives, but we will have additional food which will allow children who are slightly better off than starving, but are still malnourished, to be more nourished, and that will be better for all of society. Not only have you already undermined your opponent's argument about those 5 starving children, but you've set it up that your proposal is even better for both those starving children and the malnourished children in between. So setting up ways to undermine your opponent's argument before they make them. That leaves your opponent with a really hard decision. They can either go back into the minefield that you've already set and you've already told the judge how the argument they're about to make is wrong, or they have to get off of their game and they have to start debating other things. Neither of which is the arguments they want to be making. Neither is the way they want to be debating. So when you have this first speech, take advantage of the opportunity you have to set up the debate in your favor. So finally, let's just go over 3 key pointers to conclude. You want to set yourself up for success. Pick a case that's setting you up for success. So if you're really passionate about part of the resolution, then that's where your case should focus. If you really care about juveniles in detention, or if you really care about juveniles in the detention who've gotten caught with drugs, then focus on juveniles with drugs. If you really care a lot about the United States policy with Russia, and you want to talk specifically about nuclear weapons, and that really gets you excited, talk about nuclear weapons. Talk about the things that make you excited, because if you're more excited about it, you're going to convey that excitement and that passion to your audience, and your audience is going to be much more willing to believe you. Second, clarity is more important than creativity. I want you to be creative. I want you to come up with really interesting arguments. But at the end of the day, if you can't make it clear, get rid of it. Your judge needs to be able to understand very quickly what you're arguing. And if your judge can't understand you, the judge isn't going to vote for you. And if the judge doesn't vote for you, then you may not have lost because you didn't make interesting arguments. You lost because you lost the judge's attention. And that's not the way you ever want to lose a debate round. And finally, lay out your positive story at the very beginning. You want a positive story. You don't want to talk about how bad your opponent is. You want to talk about how good your arguments, how good you and your partner's arguments, how good the case is that you're presenting. And if you're arguing that your opponent is weak from the very beginning, then the judge is going to start to think, well, you clearly think their arguments have some merit because you keep talking about it. So instead, talk about the positive message about you the entire time. So we're going to tell a story. We're going to tell the audience, here is why this matters. Here's why you should care about it. Here's why it's a big enough problem. And here's why I have the way to fix this problem. Or here's why voting with me or listening to me is a good idea for the next 10 minutes. Think about who's talking, who's going to be reading these cases, and make sure that the cases sound like that person. You don't want a 14-year-old up there sounding like an 18-year-old. If the captain of your club writes the case, and then your freshman novice uses it, it's going to sound like the novice is using the captain's case. And that's just not going to sound as credible. Be careful using unique structures. Think about the strategy in all these cases. If you can just lay out prefatory issues, you can set your opponent up to make weak arguments and yourself up to make strong ones. And if you can spike your opponent's arguments before they even have a chance to make them, that's going to only make you stronger. And in the end, think about this whole first speech as your chance to set this entire round up so that everyone in the room is going to be thinking, wow, this debater really has her act together. She knows what the solutions are to this problem, and I want to believe her. If the judges and your audience is thinking that before the second team, your opponent even has a chance to talk, then your opponents are going to have that much steeper hill to climb.